finish it.
There's a cost.
We could have killed you. Maybe you should have.
When the original Last of Us came out back in 2013, it very quickly established itself as one of the best games of that generation, a true masterpiece that set the bar for all video games to follow. The Last of Us epitomised Naughty Dog at their finest, and the story of Joel and Ellie and the harsh post-apocalyptic world that they lived in soon captured the hearts and the minds of gamers around the world. When Naughty Dog announced that they were making a sequel that would continue the story of Joel and Ellie, set 4 years after the events of the first game, many, myself included, reacted to the news with equal parts excitement and trepidation. While the response to the original was overwhelmingly positive from both critics and gamers alike, the reaction to The Last of Us Part 2 couldn't be more divisive. No other game this year has split the community more than this one. Nowhere can this be seen more than on Metacritic right now. Critic scores that have been overwhelmingly positive, with the game currently standing at a Metacritic score of 94 from 114 critic reviews. The user score, however, couldn't be more contrasting, which currently stands at 5.6, with the positive and negative reviews split right down the middle. My own feelings on the game have at times felt equally divisive. It's been a while since a game has managed to provoke such contrasting emotional reactions, and there were definitely moments when playing where I both hated and loved the game in equal measure. The Last of Us Part 2 is most definitely a game that sticks with you long after you have beaten it. Having finished my first playthrough of the game, I am already partway through my second, and even now my initial thoughts and feelings on the game are in a constant state of flux. It's taken me a while to settle my thoughts on the game and put these to paper. So, thanks for your patience, and finally here it is, my spoiler-free review of The Last of Us Part 2. Let's start with the story. The Last of Us Part 2 picks up 4 years after the events of the first game. We rejoin Ellie and Joel, who have had years of off-screen development and have built lives and relationships in the peaceful town of Jackson. Suffice it to say, the peace and tranquility of their new lives doesn't last, and events unfold which ultimately lead Ellie onto a quest for revenge as she travels to Seattle to hunt down the WLF and the people responsible. While the first game was a more intimate story about the main characters and their developing relationship, in Part 2 it's clear that Neil Druckmann and his team wanted to tell a story with larger overarching themes. What these themes are and how you interpret the story and its message can differ from player to player. For me, the story of The Last of Us Part 2 is the story of hatred and revenge, and the struggle to retain one's humanity and compassion when faced with unspeakable acts of evil and violence. It is a story about the complexity of human emotion and the rippling effect that our actions can have. The idea that every choice we make and action taken can affect the lives of others in unforeseen ways, and that these can have very real consequences. While Druckmann's story can be extremely harrowing and hard to play in places, leaving you emotionally exhausted, it forces you into some very uncomfortable moments and asks you to view the world, its characters and events from an entirely new perspective. It is a game that makes you feel and makes you think, and should be commended for that. The story of The Last of Us Part 2 is probably the element of the game that has most divided players. Some have come to appreciate the story and its larger messages, while others absolutely hate some of the key decisions made by the writers and the new direction that the story takes these beloved characters. The story of The Last of Us Part 2 is actually the story of Ellie and Abby. Both are at different points in their quest for revenge, often act as a mirror reflection of each other, and both at times act as the main protagonist and also antagonist. I think it is the player's ability to accept the bold choices made by the writers and to connect and accept Abby's story that can affect whether you love or hate the game. For those who have played the first game and have a strong connection to the original characters of Ellie and Joel, I would advise you to go into this game with an open mind and to be prepared to look at these characters in a new light. I think if you are able to step outside of the events and look at all the moving parts of the story and characters, you may come to appreciate the goals and message of the writers. If you can't do that though, and feel extremely protective of these characters, you may struggle with the direction the game takes them in. Interestingly, my own thoughts and feelings on the story and its characters has shifted so much from my first initial emotional reaction when playing it, and that's because I've had time to really reflect on the game, and replaying it a second time is giving me an appreciation for elements I just didn't allow myself to see the first time round, and I think that is something that is pretty special. Next, let's reflect on the gameplay. The core gameplay loop from the original game is still intact, and the key pillars of exploration, resource gathering, and crafting are still there. In fact, not much has really changed. Players will spend most of their time opening cupboards and drawers as they loot rooms and check areas for resources, which can then be used to craft items, upgrade weapons, and unlock or level up abilities, thereby giving your character more options and an increased chance of survival. The developers have introduced some new elements like Findable Safes, which involve a simple puzzle-solving mechanic. It is well worth finding and unlocking these safes, as players are often rewarded with valuable ammo, resources, and even weapons and upgrades. My only gripe with these saves were that they were entirely missable, which could mean that a player may miss out on a new weapon or item that could really help them further on in the story and make a big difference to their overall enjoyment of the game. This for me was a pretty unforgivable design choice. I think if you had an issue with this part of the game in the original, then you will have an issue with it in The Last of Us Part 2, as not much has changed. For me personally, while I do think that it slows down the pacing of the game and can sometimes feel like busy work, it does also add an element to the game that I feel works in its favour, and that is the tension that it creates as you run low on resources and ammo, which causes you to change your tactics and approach. The developers have also introduced a more expansive leveling system with multiple skill trees that can be unlocked through training manuals. In order to unlock individual skills, players also need to collect resources, which can be spent to unlock abilities. One of the biggest issues I had with the leveling system was that it does not give you the freedom to pick and choose the skills that you wish to unlock and put resources into. Instead, you have to work yourself down each skill tree to reach the ability that you're after, often wasting precious resources on skills that you are not interested in. The leveling system in Part 2 feels outdated. The ability to pick and choose and to spec Ellie in the way that you want could have created some unique character builds and would have lent itself to increasing the game's replay value. It is clear that Naughty Dog have taken inspiration from Uncharted 4, and this can be seen in the level design, increased focus on exploration, and even the combat. The Last of Us Part 2 is a gorgeous looking game, and the post-apocalyptic setting of Seattle and its surrounding areas has been recreated and rendered beautifully. One of my favourite new introductions in the game was the more open world exploration of Seattle during day one of Ellie's playthrough. I really enjoyed this part of the game and would have liked this section to be longer and more expansive. Still, it's a promising direction from Naughty Dog, and the response to this section of the game has been overwhelmingly positive, so they may well look at incorporating a larger open world element in subsequent games in the series. Similarly to the first game, Naughty Dog has also introduced tons of collectibles to drive any completionist positively batty. Collectible Letters return, which shed more light on the world and the main factions and events in Seattle following Outbreak Day. As Ellie, you can also collect comic book themed character cards, which are great, and I really enjoyed reading each of these, and even enjoyed the fourth wall breaking card Dr. Uckman, which was clearly Neil Druckmann's way of putting himself into the game. His choice to be a villain, though, seems almost comical and ironic given some people's reactions to the game and the current view of Druckmann as the villain responsible. Abby's collectible coins were probably the most uninteresting of the collectibles available in the game, but I loved Ellie's journal and I found it incredibly interesting to read as it gives you a very useful insight into her psyche. One of the biggest improvements in the game is the combat. While the moment-to-moment gunplay and handling of the weapons still feels familiar, with the dreaded sway being a constant challenge at the beginning of the game until you unlock customizable improvements on the weapons and character skills to improve sway, focus, damage and reload speeds, the combat feels a lot faster and more freeform than its predecessor. A lot of this has to do with the more vertical level design, the introduction of tall grass and new stealth options, and Ellie's improved movement with a more responsive run and dodge option, the ability to jump, climb and go prone. While the game does still most definitely encourage you to use stealth over action, especially with limited resources, more aggressive enemy AI, and the new ability to craft silencers on the fly, if things do go horribly wrong, Ellie is much more agile than Joel and able to dodge and run to regroup. Or, if you're feeling confident enough, you can chain together some pretty cool looking deadly combos using a mixture of gadgets, guns and melee attacks. Thanks to some incredible looking animations and improved enemy AI, enemies coordinate, flank and press on your position. As a result, the combat feels more challenging and fluid, which requires you to think and react on the spot. It's a lot of fun once you get the basic mechanics down. The combat feels satisfying and at times brutal. Ellie can be ruthless as she takes out enemies, shooting legs to cripple as she brings them to their knees before unleashing a violent melee attack to the head. When enemies get up close and personal, the combat becomes much more visceral and scrappy as Ellie grapples with more powerful foes, using her knife to inflict small wounds, weakening her enemy before turning their weapons against them. I am currently playing back through the game on New Game Plus with all my weapons and abilities unlocked, and I'm really enjoying my second time with the game, this time experimenting to see what cool combinations and animations I can find. I will say that the friendly AI, however, leaves a lot to be desired and is most definitely hit and miss. Sometimes your companion can prove useful, covering your back and picking off enemies with well-placed shots or taking down infected stealthily, but other times the AI just gets in the way, clipping into the main character and blocking your path, or standing there doing nothing while enemies rush your position. This was another missed opportunity I felt on Naughty Dog's part to really push the game and genre forward. It would have been cool to be able to give instructions to your companion to flank the enemy or order them to focus on a particular target. I think that would have added a new tactical element to the combat that would have been fun. Of course, we can't talk about the combat without talking about the three enemy factions in the game. These are the WLF, Scars, and of course the Infected. Generally speaking, I liked each enemy faction and felt that they were distinct and unique, differing in their attacks and requiring a different approach for each. The WLF, or Washington Liberation Front, uses military weapons and tactics. They are most known for their coordinated attacks and their attack dogs, which can sniff out your position, requiring you to constantly stay on the move. Given their increased armor and firepower, I always found a stealth approach to be a more viable option when dealing with this enemy. The Scars, on the other hand, are a religious cult that refuses to use the old world technology. As such, they tend to use stealth, communicating with whistles, and using silent bows and heavy melee attacks to damage and wound enemies. I found their method of communication really off-putting, as you had no idea what they were saying to each other and what they were planning. Finally, there is The Infected. Of course, we have returning favourites from the original, including runners, stalkers, clickers, and bloaters. Naughty Dog did introduce a new kind of infected called shamblers, which throw acid clouds at you, and also another type which shows up for a boss type scenario that feels like it was ripped straight out of Resident Evil. Personally speaking though, I did like some of the improvements made to the infected so that they feel more distinct, these stalkers in particular being a personal favourite. However, I was disappointed that we only got one new type of infected and didn't find shamblers all that difficult to tackle after the first few times you face them. One well placed trip mine and they are easy to beat. For the first time, we also get to see hordes, and the game in these moments feels more akin to Days Gone. I enjoyed these moments and would have liked to have seen more of them. Finally, I don't want to finish this review without mentioning the incredible sound design, music, cinematography, facial animations, voice acting, and performance that just capture the emotions and moments of the game so powerfully that the player cannot help but be swept up by the experience. I thought Ashley Johnson as Ellie and Laura Bailey as Abby absolutely nailed it. So, overall, I found The Last of Us Part 2 an incredibly hard game to play and even harder to review. I hope I did justice to the game in this review and managed to convey my thoughts and feelings on the game in a concise and clear way. My experience of playing The Last of Us Part 2 was a roller coaster of emotions. The game pulled emotions and reactions out of me that I just wasn't expecting. While the overall themes of the game are dark and the experience of playing the game at times uncomfortable, I still really enjoyed my experience and would recommend it to others. I have gone back and forth on whether I can or should score the game and what that number would settle at. I can tell you that it has changed countless times, just as my thoughts on the game have changed over time and upon further reflection. When I played the game, there were times when it settled at a 5, average at best, frustrating in moments. But then as I played through the story and learned more and reflected upon characters and events, this score went up to a 7. Now that I have had time to really reflect and I'm discovering new things in New Game Plus and really enjoying the experience more the second time round, the game is currently lying at roughly an 8.5 out of 10. This is an above average solid game. It is not perfect and there are things I would have changed and improved. What I would like to emphasize though is that The Last of Us Part 2 is a bold game that takes risks, albeit more in its story than in its gameplay mechanics. In an industry that is filled with games that try to play it safe and appeal to as wide an audience as possible, it is refreshing to see a developer really take risks. Whether or not that risk pays off or not depends on your own opinion. Naughty Dog should, however, be commended for taking that risk, knowing that it may alienate their community. A narrative should never be driven by the need to please its community, but by the drive to tell an important story, even if it can be uncomfortable to play or experience. At least that's how I feel anyway. So, there you have it. Finally, my thoughts on The Last of Us Part 2. Hope you guys enjoyed this review and found it useful. Share your feedback in the comments below. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel and the content that I make. Anyway, hope you guys have a great week of cuss. Take care, and as always, happy gaming. Bye, guys.